Hi, everyone. I grew up eating meat. I still eat meat, and I cook with meat. And the argument I often make is I don't want my palate to be limited, the flavors and colors and textures that I put on a plate. I don't want to be limited by. I'm also a mom, and I have a beloved dog. I still use the present tense. I had a beloved dog, Barney, and who I sometimes confused with my son, who often looked at me and would go, "Mom, I'm the two-legged one." So I have this completely chaotic relationship with animals, and I welcomed, when I was handed Jonathan Safran Foer's book, Eating Animals, I welcomed somebody who was maybe going to make an argument about vegetarianism, and that is what the book is not. It is a subjective, starting from his childhood, he describes his relationship to animals and to eating animals, and goes from there to a very big view about what maybe our relationship and our responsibility are and should be. It's a different argument than Michael Pollan's argument. Michael Pollan is somebody who we on the food team refer to often, and we often refer to Food Rules, his book, as our Bible. So I really enjoyed reading Jonathan's book very, very much, and I can't wait to hear more from him. So here he is.
Thank you so much. It was a very thoughtful introduction, and I found that I was quite worried when I published the book, or when I anticipated the publication of the book, because I thought that I would have a certain set of built-in natural enemies, and I had assumed that chefs were going to be one kind of enemy, and that farmers were going to be another kind of enemy. And what I found, since the book has been in the world and I've been able to talk to lots of different kinds of audiences, is that the strongest or the most enthusiastic response has actually been from chefs and farmers, farmers in particular, and that the most negative responses have come from where I thought the most positive responses would come, which is the animal rights movement, who often feel as if the book didn't go far enough. But it means a lot to me that you would speak so generously about the book, and I think that part of the solution to this problem, and it seems to me whatever side you come down on in terms of eating meat or not eating meat or what kind of meat, you really have to recognize that there's a problem. We have a serious problem. And part of the solution is going to be making visible these presently invisible alliances, like between someone who's concerned with animal welfare and a chef who likes to cook meat. We're used to thinking of these people at being on opposite ends of a spectrum, or a cattle rancher and an activist at PETA. We think that these represent the extremes. And my experience when I met these people and heard their stories was that I was surprised to find that they're on the same end of the spectrum, and opposite people who are willfully ignorant or willfully forget that we have this horrible problem in front of us. Well, I'm grateful to be speaking to you. It's I'm sure you take for granted how unusual a place this is, but it was a real revelation walking in here today. I am a layman with computers and technology, and I am, I guess, still under the impression that Google is like a search engine, and if you need to find something, you type Google and you enter it and you get a whole bunch of responses. And I can't for the life of me imagine why this requires so many people and so many buildings. But as I walk the campus, I say, oh, a lot of bicycles, they're very colorful. And the person who was walking with me said, oh, Google provides those bicycles. And in the lobby, there was a cooler filled with drinks, and it was unlocked, and it didn't have any place to insert money. And I said, oh, Google provides those. I started getting this image of a place that is really nice to work until I went into the men's room and I noticed that there were toothbrushes on shelves. And suddenly I understood everything that was going on here, that it's all a down payment on your time. Toothbrushes at work, what an absolutely horrible, miserable thing. My God, I'm so glad I don't have to have a toothbrush where I work. But then again, I don't work anywhere, so I guess I'm unusually lucky. So I thought what I would do is talk for a little bit about this book, the research that went into it, and why I decided to write it. I'm not a journalist, I'm not an activist, I'm not a philosopher, I'm not even an animal person, I'm not really an environmentalist. And most of the people who become engaged with this subject in any kind of, devoted way are one of those things. I thought I would talk about why I did get involved with it, give you some sense of what the book is, and some of the conclusions that I reached, and then leave as much time as possible for something resembling a conversation, because this is a subject that is very well served by conversation and very poorly served by a lecture. We perceive it to be very controversial and very touchy. As I was saying, when I anticipated the book coming out, I thought it was going to be a really difficult and trying and maybe even dangerous experience. I had heard stories from friends of mine who had written books about food, not even targeting the meat industry in particular, but targeting the industrialized food system, who at various times had to have bodyguards when they would give readings because they had so many threatening people come up to them afterward at the signing. And I thought that I was really going for, the bullseye of this unfortunate target, and that I had imagined many times, for some reason my mind would cling to the image of someone throwing ground beef at me at a reading. And I became so convinced that this would happen. It's probably just narcissism, but I became so convinced it would happen that I would think, well, what's the right move if someone should do that? Do I pretend it didn't happen and just read as if, there weren't meat stuck to the wall behind me? Or throw it back? Or when somebody would inevitably in the audience say, hey, kick that guy out, would I then say, no, let the guy sit. I want to talk to this person and try to engage the person? Anyway, it never happened. And no one ever got angry with me. And most surprisingly, no one ever disagreed with me. And I don't think this is because I'm such a persuasive arguer. I think it's because the case against factory farming is so persuasive. I spent 3 years researching it, and I've spent about a year talking about it now, and I've yet to meet the person who wants to publicly stand up and defend it. And there's been absolutely no response from the industry itself, which is perhaps the most shocking thing I've encountered in the process of researching and writing this book. I mean, it's insane if you think about it. If I wrote a book about Google and said, Google is an evil company for these reasons, here are 80 pages of endnotes citing facts about, Google's horrificness, and here are testimonies from former Google employees explaining why it's a horrible company, and here's why we need less Google in the world. If I were to do that, rest assured Google would respond somehow, or someone would respond on Google's behalf. I'd probably be sued into oblivion, first of all. And secondly, somebody would say, either you've got it completely wrong or you're not telling the full story. And here's the rest of the story. And that never came. There was no response from a meat industry that has one of the most powerful lobbies in the world. And so this suggests one of two things. Either I got it all right, all of my facts are right, my argument is right, and they are effectively, raising the white flag and submitting, which is not the case, or they are recognizing that the expansion of this conversation is against their interests. That the more people think and talk about this and examine what's going on, what we have and what our choices are, the less inclined they will be to eat meat. Now, I've been a little bit sloppy so far in speaking about meat and speaking about factory farming as if they were perfectly interchangeable, and they're not. Everybody knows what meat is. Factory farming is quite hard to define because it's not any particular set of technology so much as a mindset that I think is most simply described as a farming that takes nature as an obstacle to be overcome rather than any kind of guide. So the idea that sick animals are better than healthy animals, the idea that environmental destruction is better in a business model than sustainability, the idea that human health is of no great regard. So 99% of the animals that we eat in this country now come from factory farms. Less than 1% come from the kinds of farms that probably everybody in this room holds an image of in his or her mind when thinking about farming. You know, we imagine a barn and animals on grass and sunshine and soil and hay and fence posts and a farmer and his wife and so on. And that has no correlation to reality, or at least it represents the tiniest little sliver of reality. Reality is animals being raised in extreme concentrations, almost always indoors, almost always fed antibiotics and other drugs from birth until death, almost always kept in conditions that would be illegal if they were dogs or cats. Environmental destruction is built into the business model. You know, a company like Smithfield had 7,000 violations of the Clean Water Act in 1 year. So if they'd had 10, we would say that's regrettable. If they'd had 100, we would say someone needs to keep a better eye on this company. But 7,000 starts to seem like it's on purpose, like it's as much as they can get away with. And as it turns out, they can get away with really anything. Animal agriculture is the #1 cause of global warming. The UN has said it's one of the top 2 or 3 causes of every significant environmental problem on the planet, locally and globally: air pollution, water pollution, deforestation, loss of biodiversity. The climate chief of the United Kingdom said in an interview a couple of months ago, and this is not, you know, a henchman of PETA, and this is not a vegetarian, he said that the only way to save the planet is a global movement toward vegetarianism. Al Gore now talks about the need to reduce meat consumption. We're at a point where we know that, you know, we cannot continue to think of ourselves as environmentalists while eating factory farm meat regularly. And it's a very strange subject because, as I was saying, we perceive it to be divisive. We think that there's going to be an argument. We think people are going to feel aggressive or defensive whenever we talk about meat, despite the fact that it represents our most important relationship to animals. And there's not a person in this room, or not a person in wherever these other rooms are, who is indifferent to animals. Such people don't exist. 96% of Americans think that animals deserve legal protection. 76% of Americans think that farmed animals deserve strict protection from cruelty. It's pretty wild to think of anything that 95% or 75% of Americans agree on at this point. Whether or not you believe in global warming or not, you believe it would matter if the globe was warming. And you believe that it matters that, you know, the quality of the air that we breathe and the quality of the water that we drink matters. And so, as I was saying, we're in this odd position where we have this daily act, and for most people it's 2 times a day, and for some people it's 3 times a day, that is our most important relationship to the environment and our most important relationship to the animal world. And yet, so many of us find ways not to think about it. So when writing this book, I wanted to find a way to think about it and find a way to encourage other people to think about it. It's not any kind of straightforward case for vegetarianism, but it is a very strong case for engaging with this problem. So I thought what I would do is read a tiny bit so you get a sense of what the book is like, the ways in which it is sort of journalism and sort of philosophy, but not really either of those things, and much more of a story. And then we can have a kind of conversation about it. So I'm going to begin by reading a letter that I wrote near the beginning of the research that I did. I thought that this research would take me a month or 2 months, and that I would do it through Google, and a little bit of reading and maybe a couple of short trips. It ended up taking 3.5 years, in part because it's such a complicated subject, and in part because of letters like this. To whom it may concern at Tyson Foods. I'm following up on my previous letters of January 10th, February 27th, March 15th, April 20th, May 15th, and June 7th. To reiterate, I'm a new father, eager to learn as much as I can about the meat industry in an effort to make informed decisions about what to feed my son. Given that Tyson Foods is the world's largest processor and marketer of chicken, beef, and pork, your company is an obvious place to start. I'd like to visit some of your farms and speak with company representatives about everything from the nuts and bolts of how your farms operate to animal welfare and environmental issues. If possible, I'd also like to speak with some of your farmers. I can make myself available at just about any time and on relatively short notice, and I'm happy to travel as is needed. Given your family-centered philosophy and recent "It's What Your Family Deserves" advertising campaign, I assume you'll appreciate my desire to see for myself where my son's food comes from. Thanks so much for your continued consideration. Best, Jonathan Safran Foer. And so Tyson Food is not any worse than any other company in the meat industry in America. It's not any better either. I sent dozens of these letters. I made dozens of phone calls, and I was met always with evasion or silence or "we'll get back to you," or "it's not a very good time for us," or "because of this biosecurity risk, we're actually not able to have visitors." And I basically wasn't able to see anything this way. There was a way that I was able to see things, which I'll get to in a minute. Now, just as a quick aside, small and family farmers, that less than 1% of the industry, responded very, very differently. When I would ask to see a farm, they were enthusiastic to host me, and they would answer any questions I had, even when they knew the answers were not flattering. I was always forthright about who I was and what I was interested in finding out and what I might write about it. But it's a worthwhile little test. You know, if you are somebody who eats meat, open your refrigerator and look at the label on the first thing you pull out, and just for fun, call the company or write a letter to them, just because why not? Because in life, we feel like we deserve such answers, especially when we're giving a lot of money to these places, and more importantly, we're ingesting their products. We're bringing them into our bodies and feeding them to loved ones quite often. And as far as I can tell, the meat industry and the military are the great exceptions in American business, certainly in food. You know, if you wanted to find out where your apple juice came from, you could pretty easily get an invitation to the orchard and the processing facility. If you want to know how your bagel is made, they'll let you behind the counter at the bakery or deli. But here, there is just nothing to be learned. So I investigated other ways of learning. If they weren't going to make themselves available, there had to be ways of getting into these farms. And what I ended up doing was what I'm about to read. I'm wearing black in the middle of the night in the middle of nowhere. This was, by the way, not all that far from here. There are surgical booties around my disposable shoes and latex gloves on my shaking hands. I pat myself down, quintuple checking that I have everything. Red filtered flashlight, picture ID, $40 cash, video camera, copy of California Penal Code 597E, bottle of water, not for me, silent cell phone, and blowhorn. We kill the engine and roll the final 30 yards to the spot we scouted out earlier in the day on one of our half-dozen drive-bys. This isn't the scary part yet. I'm accompanied tonight by an animal activist who I refer to as C in the book. It wasn't until I picked her up that I realized I'd been picturing someone who inspired confidence, but C is short and wispy. She wears aviator glasses, flip-flops, and a retainer. I could be describing half the people in the room, actually. You have a lot of cars, I observed. I could be describing myself, to be frank. You have a lot of cars, I observed, as we pulled away from her house. I live with my parents for now, she said. As we drove down the highway known to locals as Bloodrun, both because of the frequency of accidents and the number of trucks that use the road to transport animals to slaughter, C explained that sometimes entry is as simple as walking through an open gate, although this has become increasingly rare given concerns about biosecurity and troublemakers. More often these days, fences have to be hiked. Occasionally, lights and alarms go off. Every now and then, there are dogs, every now and then unleashed. She once encountered a bull that was left to roam among the sheds, waiting to impale snooping vegetarians. Bull, I half-echoed, half-asked, with no obvious linguistic intent. Male cow, she said brusquely, as she sorted through a bag of what appeared to be dental equipment. And if you and I should tonight encounter a bull, we won't, she said. A tailgater forced me behind a truck packed tight and piled high with chickens on their way to slaughter. Well, hypothetically, stand very still, C advised. I don't think they see stationary objects. If the question is if things ever gone seriously wrong on one of C's night visits, the answer is a resounding yes. There was the time she fell into a manure pit, a dying rabbit under each arm, and found herself up to her neck, literally, in literally deep shit. And the night she was forced to spend in construction paper blackness with 20,000 miserable animals and their fumes, having accidentally locked herself in the shed. And the near-fatal case of Campylobacter one of her cohorts picked up from picking up a chicken. Feathers were collecting on the windshield. I turned on the wiper and asked, "What's all that stuff in your bag?" In case we need to make a rescue. I had no idea what she was referring to, and I didn't like it. Now, you said you don't think bulls see stationary objects. Wouldn't this qualify, though, as one of those things you absolutely need to know? I don't mean to belabor the point, but what the hell have I gotten myself into? I'm not a journalist, activist, veterinarian, lawyer, or philosopher, as to my knowledge have been the others who have made such a trip. I'm not up for anything, and I'm not someone who can stand very still in front of a guard bull. If I imagined the meat coming at me many times, I also imagined what would actually happen if I did face down this bull, knowing that I had to stand still, and what would I think about? Baseball, or my parents having intercourse, or something that would completely paralyze me. We come to a gravelly stop at the planned-upon spot and wait for our synchronized watches to click over to 3 a.m., the planned-upon time. The dog we'd seen earlier in the day can't be heard, although that's hardly a comfort. I take the scrap of paper from my pocket and read it one last time, and then I give the text of California Penal Code 597E, which says basically if you come upon an animal that is impounded and without proper access to food and water, you are allowed to take it upon yourself to provide food and water, and you're not liable for trespassing or any other laws you might break in the process. So this is how animal activists get onto farms. They use this in California. They use this law, this loophole. And it's pretty interesting why there are laws that, the particular laws that forbid one from having access to farms are quite extreme. After September 11th, the government passed an Animal Terrorism Act, which makes trespassing onto a farm not an act of trespass, but an act of terrorism. It's worth investigating what is meant by that. You know, the most generous interpretation, I guess, is that the government was legitimately afraid that some terrorist would come and, I don't know, poison our food supply. But when you put it in the context of what it is this farm system has done, 76 million Americans get food poisoning every year, and the CDC says the prime culprit is animal agriculture. I mean, no terrorist is that ambitious. One of the top 2 or 3 causes of every significant environmental problem on the planet. Swine flu, H1N1, which moved across the United States and the world and killed relatively few, but could have killed 100 million people. There's absolutely no reason it didn't. It just didn't happen to mutate in a particular way. Originated on a hog farm in North Carolina. So it's possible that we have our definition of terrorism backwards. So I read California Penal Code, and I say, which, despite being state law, is about as reassuring as Cujo's silence. I'm imagining some roused from REM sleep and well-armed farmer coming upon, I know the difference between arugula and rugelach, scrutinizing the living conditions of his turkeys. He cocks his double barrel, my sphincter relaxes, and then what? I whip out California Penal Code 597E. Is that going to make his finger less or more itchy? It's time we use a series of dramatic hand signals to communicate what a simple whisper would have done just as well. But we've taken vows of silence, not a word until we're safely on the way home. The twirl of a latex index finger means let's roll. You first, I blurt. And now for the scary part. So as I ended up seeing this farm, which was a turkey farm, and seeing many other farms of all the food species, and I went to lots of processing plants, slaughterhouses, and the scary part was really this veil of secrecy, just how impossible it was to learn about food. You know, the fact that almost every door that I encountered to one of these windowless sheds was locked, and not because they were afraid of an animal, turning the doorknob and escaping, and not because they were afraid of somebody stealing the animals, because that's not a real concern when it comes to chickens or turkeys. But they're afraid of us. They're afraid of the people who buy their products and eat their products, learning what these products really are, how they are brought to our tables and what the effects are. And it's infuriating. And there were many times when I was writing this book that I regretted that I was writing this book, because I like to be a novelist. It's how I think of myself. It's how I like to spend my time. I can't think of a better way to spend my time. And yet I put aside about 3.5 years to write this. But whenever I was feeling unmotivated, or whenever I was feeling uninspired, or when I felt that maybe I shouldn't be working on this book, I would think of those locked doors. And they just made me so angry that they would provide more than enough fuel for the engine of the book. So I've now given you some introduction, and I think it would be best to try to have a kind of conversation. And as I said, I would love to hear somebody stand up and say you've got it all wrong. But short of that, I would love to hear, questions, of course, but also any experiences you might have had, with meat or farming or anything like that.
So, my name's Anne, and I wanted to, oh, sure. Hi, everyone. I wanted to address a piece that I felt like you really focused on at the beginning of your story that I think is missing in this greater conversation, and that's the connection between food and meat within that and family. And I really appreciated that that's where you started, because I don't know about any of you if you've made choices about what you eat or started to think about changes that you've made. I've found that the hardest part is the family piece, and that when you talk to your friends or coworkers or anyone else in your life, they seem to be a lot more accepting of, oh, you've decided to do X, Y, or Z, and it can even be considered cool or appealing or whatever. And family's been the hard one, at least for me, and I got the impression that it has been to some extent for you in terms of extended family, and I guess I'm just wondering not if you have any advice, but just I feel like we need to come up with some sort of safe way to approach some of these conversations with the people who started to feed you, and you don't want to make them feel guilty because they're your mom and you're saying mushroom soup on everything is disgusting or whatever. But I wanted to bring up that piece of it is, I think, an important starting point in terms of how we educate is the people who are closest to home, as opposed to raging activism to these large companies that aren't so close, because it starts local, I guess.
Well, I make no effort to educate or persuade people close to me, at least not in any active way, because I think there's the danger in making the person the referent or the person the subject of your conversation, rather than what you really want to be the subject, which is this problem that faces all of us. And, I've just never had any success, to be honest, in a one-on-one conversation trying to persuade somebody to eat differently, and so I don't try anymore. What I find is very successful is explaining when asked, waiting till someone asks, and then explaining honestly why I do what I do, trying to give an answer that corresponds to the nature of their question. Sometimes people will say, oh, why didn't you get a burger? And they don't want to hear, do you have any idea where that burger comes from? And
right. Exactly.
So you can say something like, I actually don't eat burgers. I read this thing, now available in paperback by Jonathan Safran Foer, about the environmental effects, and I've been thinking a lot about the environment, so I'm just trying to eat less. I think actually moving away from the binary vegetarian or not is
Right.
one of the most successful tactics, and moving toward I'm trying to eat less meat.
Yeah.
And for me, it happens to be 0. That's how little meat I eat, but I am just somebody trying to eat less meat. And I think that's it creates a huge opening for people who care but are not going to care ultimately, which frankly is most people. Most people are not going to become vegetarian anytime soon. But I do think that confronted with these realities, most people are ready to eat 1 serving less a week. I mean, I think that's possible. And I think most people are probably ready to eat 3 or 4 or 5 servings less a week. But they have to be given that space without like a fear of being called a hypocrite. Because, the danger when talking about these things is to reach right for the extremes, like the margins of the conversation. Well, you're a vegetarian, but you're wearing leather shoes. But you're a vegetarian, but I saw you swat a fly the other day. And why? I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but this is what happens in so many of these conversations. And what's happened is we've allowed the realization that we won't be perfect to be an excuse not to try. And we need to think about these things like we think about the environment. So it's no longer a sensical question to ask, are you an environmentalist or not? I mean, would you have a good answer for that? It's a weird question. It's almost like asking if you're a feminist or not.
Sure.
Like, of course, but I guess, unless you mean crazy, I meant that, by the way, about the environment, not about feminism.
Good.
Yeah. So, I try to buy good appliances. I don't leave the car idling. I turn off lights when I leave a room. And yet I flew here, from New York, and I know that that's about as bad as it gets in terms of my transportational footprint. But I didn't get off the plane, throw my hands up in the air, call home and say, turn the car on, let it idle, because it's not an all or nothing proposition. Instead, we do our best to recognize the choices that are in front of us, and then also our ability to make better choices. And so I think it's the exact same thing with food. We have to get away from this idea, I was a vegetarian for 6 years, but then I found myself in a bus station at 2 in the morning, and the only thing that was open was KFC, and all they had left were chicken things, and so I ate them, and that was the end of my vegetarianism. I've heard a lot of that, and you've probably heard that too. As if like the slightest encroachment meant it's time to stop trying. And if you imagine applying that standard to any other realm of decision making, it's foolish. It's crazy. Like, I used to be someone who tried to tell the truth. Then my mom came down the stairs on the way to a party and asked if she looked nice in a dress, and I said yes. So now I lie at every available opportunity.
Right.
It just doesn't make any sense. And so I think guiding the conversation toward the middle ground, like, you know what, I've been thinking about this, and Jesus, it matters to me. Like, it really has to matter to me that that this is so environmentally destructive. And I'm not really all that into animals, but some things are just wrong. And this is wrong. I know what's going on is wrong, so I'm trying to eat less of it. I think that is actually a very successful approach, because it doesn't make the other person the topic of your conversation.
And I guess I just think that one of the sort of fallbacks is that this is our tradition. This is our tradition. This is our culture. But it's such a short tradition that this factory farming piece has been a part of the picture. I mean,
well, you also have other traditions and cultures, like caring, like,
right.
Some people find their values in the Bible. Some people find their values in stories that grandparents taught them. But they all ultimately actually teach the same lessons,
right.
About like dominion and stewardship, like what it means to be a human, and to have, what responsibilities that entails, and also what it means to be like a citizen of the earth. And this is something that I felt as I was writing the book, and I've been very, very happy in feeling like it's been shown out in the conversations that I've had since, which is that we all already share the values that would inspire one to stop eating meat or to eat less meat. No one needs to acquire new values. You don't need to persuade anybody to care about these things, only to act on the care that they already have. And so then it's a question of, well, what are the different ways that people can act? How can you expand the action rather than contract it? And it might be that holding a sign that says meat is murder on a street corner contracts people's desire to act, whereas like offering them flexibility, people say, yeah, that might feel good, I'll try that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi. Thanks for the book. Reading it was quite an experience. And then at the end, I still felt there were a few questions that seemed to me obvious that were left unanswered, and I went to your online forum and still didn't find the answers. So the first one was you talked about factory farming of meat, but not of dairy and eggs so much, and it seemed that the issues apply identically. The second was somebody must have brought up the issue that crop agriculture, industrial crop agriculture, kills a lot of animals too and causes animal suffering. And then the third one was...
Let's do one at a time because I know I'll just forget otherwise.
Okay.
So in terms of eggs and dairy, I didn't include them because they just weren't in the scope of this book, but you're absolutely right that they're precisely the same problems.
Okay.
I mean, I made a lot of decisions in the interest of having this be accessible and hopefully persuasive. And sometimes that meant sacrificing comprehensiveness one can state things in many different ways and be equally truthful. And I made certain choices, and sometimes I regretted that I didn't state them in other ways that are maybe more stringent or, like anybody, you feel differently about the same thing at different times of the day and over the course of a week or month or year. And there are passages that I look back at and I regret that I didn't say something more strongly. And there are passages that I look back and I regret having said it so strongly. But I was trying to strike the balance. That scene of breaking into the farm, I was conveying a very difficult aspect of writing this book, which was getting to the information itself. But a more difficult thing was getting the tone right.
Hmm.
And then growing crops kills animals, basically.
And so I'm sure people brought that up as an argument.
The goal is not to be these, kumbaya, perfect, harming. Well, no, perhaps that is the goal, but it's not what we're realistically aiming ourselves toward. There's a big difference between a tractor accidentally, and it is accidental even if you know what's going to happen in the course of crop agriculture, killing however many, woodchucks, what live in the ground? Beavers? I have no idea. Republicans? There's a big difference between that and, knowingly creating cages for pregnant animals so small they can't turn around. Part of this has to do with the effects on the world, and part of it has to do with the effects on ourselves. And we do pay a price for making these decisions individually and as a culture.
Okay. And then the third one was somebody somewhere must have asked you, how do you know plants don't feel pain?
How do I know plants don't feel pain?
Hasn't somebody asked you that question in your
They
discussion?
usually ask it in a more annoying form, which is something like, but don't you hear the carrots crying?
Yeah.
I don't know that plants don't feel pain. I don't know that you feel pain. We make assumptions, and our assumptions are usually based in evidence and science. So science gives us many, many reasons to think that other human beings experience pain in a way that's sort of similar to the ways that we do. And it also gives us reasons to think that dogs care when you kick them, and that a pig cares when you kick it, and that a cow cares when you kick it, and that a fish on a hook that appears to be struggling for its life and appears to be squirming in something like pain is not just giving us false indications. That the chemistry of its brain, the ways that the nerves are organized, resemble those in humans to such an extent that we have good reason to think that they are having experiences that include suffering or pain or whatever you want to call it. And we don't have any reason to think that plants experience pain. But, as I said, we'll never know. So it comes down to what kind of assumptions you want to make. And it's better to be someone who makes generous assumptions than someone who's miserly with his assumptions. You depend on me to believe you when you slam your thumb in a car door and say, oh, Jesus Christ, that fucking hurts. You want me to say, hey, are you okay? Do you need to go to the hospital? Because I could make other assumptions about you. I could say, oh, there he goes again, just showing me all the symptoms, exhibiting all of the pain behavior, but I know he's not really feeling pain. In fact, humans are good at doing this, and have historically been very good about assuming that other humans don't feel things in the same way. Humans of different races or sexes. The goal in life is to expand, I think, our definition of pain, not to contract it.
Thank
If
you.
you're proven wrong,
Yeah.
You know, if you're proven wrong and it turns out the pig actually feels nothing, what have you lost? A bunch of pretty good meals. But if you're proven right, then we have something very, very serious on our hands.
Hi there. Thank you so much for coming. I love your fiction, and I read this book, and I love your nonfiction. It's also preaching to the choir because I'm an 11-year vegetarian who doesn't wear leather. But my question is, I learned all these interesting facts that just further solidified my decisions, but I wanted to see if you had any ideas on how we can take this to the next step and impact the food industry, and take all these facts and make sure that these atrocities don't happen, because they're not only, what I perceive to be cruel, but they're unhealthy for humans.
Well, farmers grow what we ask them to grow, not what they want to grow. And if you go to any supermarket now, you'll see cage-free or free-range eggs, and you wouldn't have seen them in any supermarket probably 5 years ago. You see it in gas stations now. I mean, everywhere they have them. And it's not because these companies woke up and said, it's probably just the right thing to do to get them out of these cages. They did it because it's what people asked for. It's the fastest growing sector in the food industry, cage-free and free-range eggs, not in Berkeley and not in Brooklyn, but in the entire United States. It's a food that doesn't taste any better and isn't any better for us, but people are buying because it's just the right thing to do. No one needs to be persuaded that it's wrong to keep an animal that's the size of a football in a cage about the size of this book. It's just not right. So as people have asked for different things, they've started producing different things. So at a certain point, I think a tipping point will be reached, in much the same way that it was reached with smoking. Where there was a period when everyone had access to the information, and we all knew it, but we just weren't quite acting on it, and the conversation had to expand and change in such a way that it just, one thing, led to another, and suddenly there was legislation happening at the same time as the consciousness was changing. And now, it's legal to smoke cigarettes. It will always be legal to eat meat. But I do think that in the not too distant future, the question won't be why don't you eat it, but why do you eat it?
Thank you.
I have a somewhat similar question to the question that she just asked. I feel really lucky that I live in San Francisco, that I have access to all of these, free-range eggs, organic meat, no hormone, no antibiotics. And one of the things that changed the way I eat, and I'm not a vegetarian, but I try to limit, or I try to at least know where my meat comes from, was the Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch Card for seafood. So every time I go to a restaurant or I'm eating fish somewhere, I look up to see that fish species, and it's totally revolutionized my purchasing and my consumption. And again, I feel in a way like this is like I'm a little bit in a igloo, because I'm lucky enough to have
Did you
the
say
wealth.
an igloo or an emu? I didn't hear what you said.
Igloo, because I'm lucky.
Igloo?
Or like a bubble.
Like an Eskimo house. Is that what you're saying? I honestly can't hear what you're saying.
My point is that I'm lucky enough to be
Yeah.
able to make these purchasing decisions about the food that I eat.
Right.
So I guess my question is, if there were some kind of an app where I could say, okay, Foster Farms, chicken, what's the condition of living for that animal versus, I don't know, Petaluma, poultry, or something like
Well, it's
that.
very difficult because these are not individual farms. They're farm conglomerates. And even on the best farms, what you would really want is to be able to trace an individual animal and to know, was this animal given antibiotics at any point in its life? And it's not always bad to give an animal antibiotics. A sick animal should be given antibiotics, and a healthy animal should not. We give 8 times the amount of antibiotics to healthy animals as we do to sick people. Not only because they've been bred in such a way that they are destined for illness, but because it makes them grow faster. That's the real reason antibiotics are given to animals. So the challenge would not be to identify which brands are good or bad, but which animals are raised under what conditions. And there's just too much information that we could never know. Was this animal slaughter botched? That's a really important thing to most people. Like, if you found out that the steak you were about to eat came from a cow that for 2.5 minutes experienced its own slaughter, let's just say had its skin pulled up over its head, you probably wouldn't want to eat it, right? Most people wouldn't. So that would be a useful piece of information to you. but you'll never get that piece of information. And so what happens is when you eat meat, you make a wager. You know, like, I think this is probably good enough, or I don't think it's good enough. And we don't have nearly enough information to know. I mean, Temple Grandin, who's the most important person in the livestock industry, did an audit of cattle processing plants and found that about 32% of the time during her announced audits, her pre-announced audits, there were deliberate acts of cruelty happening on a regular basis. And that's a really crazy thing to hear, that when they knew someone was going to be there watching, about a third of the time, they were not accidental acts of cruelty, but deliberate acts of cruelty, not happening rarely, but on a regular basis. So numbers have improved, I should say, since she made that audit. But, you know, maybe should we think 1 out of 3, 1 out of 2? Everyone has his or her own calculus. What I know is when I don't eat meat, I don't get involved with that wager. You know, I get it right every time. That I don't have to worry about, was this a farm where they keep the manure in lagoons outside and it inevitably runs off into, you know, local waterways and gets sprayed through aerosol over, you know, neighboring fields? Or was this a farm where they have proper waste management? Was this a farm where farm workers are pushed to such an extent that they become at least sloppy and at most sadistic? Or is this a farm where workers are treated well? You know, get a decent wage, are allowed to have some control over their techniques and do their job thoughtfully and respectfully. We just can't know all of that stuff, and there is no way that we will ever know. Fish are quite different because you're just looking to see if a species is right or not. It's not, by the way, that, you know, one shouldn't necessarily feel perfect confidence in just knowing that a certain kind of tilapia is okay. It says nothing about how that specific fish was caught, you know, what the bycatch rate was, or what the fish itself went through, which might seem like a silly or flaky suggestion that I'm making, but, you know, we have very, very good reasons to think that they feel quite a bit, and perhaps every bit as much as like a chicken does, or maybe even a cow. And, you know, some people say that's regrettable, I don't care that much. Some people say I care enough to order something else. But my only point is you're always going to be largely ignorant. And that's something I'm not comfortable with 3 times a day or 2 times a day or even once a day.
Hey, thanks for coming. I really appreciate it. So I'd actually kind of like to make an argument for factory farming in some cases. I think there's all the cases that you've been talking about have been very easily demonizable, like beef slaughter, chicken slaughter. Hard to argue with a lot of those cases. But what about where the lifestyle of this animal in the wild is threatened by there not being a factory farm situation? I'm thinking in particular like, well, you just brought up fish. So where tuna is becoming extinct, certain species of salmon are becoming extinct. And without factory farming institutions, the demand is such that the fish farmers or the fishermen are driven to want to drive these animals into extinction. So. All
right, so just to be clear, we'll only talk about fish, unless you can think of an example.
We'll keep that barrier set up, and we won't go into wildlife of cows.
Salmon farming was developed for the reason you're describing, to take pressure off wild salmon populations. And it's a kind of smart idea. Like if we're going to fish these things into extinction, and by the way, fisheries scientists now estimate that in the year 2048, we will have fished all wild fish into extinction. All wild fish in every ocean. There will be 0 wild fish. And if that sound, they're not saying in about 50 years or midway into the century. In 2048, it's based on very precise calculations. So fishermen said, just out of self-interest, we need some more supply somehow. We can't, there will be no business if we use all of these up. And so salmon farming was developed. But a curious thing happened, which was that as salmon farming took off, the pressure on wild salmon populations increased rather than decreased, because eating is habit forming. And as there was more supply of salmon, there was the demand rose faster than the supply, because you would see it on more menus and you would see someone eating it at a table next to you. And the way most people eat does not involve lots of inquiry. Maybe people here it does, but most people, you see someone eating salmon, you think that looks pretty good, I'll get the salmon. And you don't say, is this farmed or is it wild caught? And this gets to a point that the consumer can't be responsible for asking that question.
Except when it tastes better. The
Well,
wild is typically
the question is, does it taste infinitely good?
Sure.
I mean, things can taste better and better and better, but do they taste infinitely good? And is there anything that brings us more pleasure than the taste of salmon? Most people would say yes. So we don't need all of the choices that we have. This is like, we don't need the choice to buy children's toys that are painted with lead paint. This is not a choice we need. It doesn't make our lives richer. It doesn't make us feel more free or in touch with our Constitution. And we don't need the choice to buy Chilean sea bass. We just don't need it in supermarkets or restaurants. We shouldn't have it. And this is what should happen with seafood, is certain seafoods should just become illegal. Foods where it falls upon the consumer's responsibility to be knowledgeable and make good decisions about things that one couldn't conceivably be expected to.
We have time for one more question, and perhaps you'd like to ask the folks in the VC rooms.
Oh, sure. I don't know exactly. I've never addressed a screen before, but how do we know they're actually there? Look, they're not responding when I say that.
Does
Little
anybody
bit.
have a question from our
Hi, we're
VC
here.
rooms? To prove you exist? We have time for one last question.
Well, someone has one here, so we might as well.
Last question.
Hi, thanks very much for coming. If what you said near the beginning during your introduction is true, then almost everybody, at least in the United States, knows at least some of the reasons why eating meat is the end of a chain of causes and effects that has all sorts of bad consequences. And so eating meat is, for many people, a willful act of setting aside what they think or what they know. And that's an uncomfortable thing to think about. It just seems to me that it's pretty important to address how people feel about eating meat in addition to how they think about eating meat. And I think this is the way people invest their own sense of virtue and their own sense of personal morality into what they do is what leads to questions like, why are you wearing leather shoes if you're a vegetarian? Is this feeling that there are virtue points to be scrabbled over and that you can't let the other person have all of them? And so I just wanted to get more of your thoughts on how to make thinking about that less uncomfortable, less of something that people want to run away from, not because of what they think, but because of their emotions.
I guess I would just return to what I said before and finding a way to make it participatory and inclusionary rather than exclusionary, rather than, who is getting it more right than somebody else. We all depend on a certain, I don't know if you call it forgiveness or generosity from our friends not to call us out, every time that we fall short. I don't give as much money to charity as I should. I don't volunteer as much as I should. And yet, if my friends were to point that out, I don't think that I would do those things more. I might even do them less. But if my friend said, you know what, on Saturday I was thinking about going to this homeless shelter to make some sandwiches. I've just been bothered. I've just been feeling really guilty by how many homeless people I've been seeing in the neighborhood recently, and I thought I would do something. I would say I'll go too. I just would, because it would be participatory and inclusionary, and I know that the experience would make me feel better. And so the challenge is to present it in a way that it is not a deprivation, but that it is something that gives you more, where you end, of course, you're going to remove certain choices from your life, and you're also going to remove certain pleasures from your life. That's something we haven't really talked about, but meat smells good and tastes good. It does. I think I'm glad in your introduction you said what you did, that you want to have as full a palate as you can when performing your art. But we don't have a full palate as it is. I mean, there are foods you would not serve, ever. You wouldn't serve chimp, for example. So humans are very good at saying no to things we want in the interest of other things we want. And saying no to things that we want a lot more than we want meat. So we just have to, I think it's a question of getting used to it, you know, like acclimating to a different world. The world 50 years ago was not this world. There wasn't the same urgency in the problem. We didn't have, also, you know, the knowledge that we now have entails a responsibility, because like we can't plead ignorance like people could have 10 or 20 years ago. And I wrote this in the book, and I believe it, that it will be asked of us, what did you do when you learned about this? And I would much rather say I withdrew than I forgot about it.
Thanks.
I wanted to thank Jonathan for being here today and let you know that we have books from Books Inc. in the back, as well as T-shirts. The T-shirts are free, the books are $5, and Jonathan will be available to do some signing. Thank you so much for being such a great audience, too.